Sunday soul. In Columbia, Sunday soul. Sunday soul. In Columbia, Sunday soul.
American freedoms are at stake today, and the 2022 midterm elections allowed us to see that the divide in America is still very deep in some places, including right here in South Carolina. Republicans expanded their control at both the federal and state levels, and with it, a desire, some say, to push our state back into the Jim Crow era. Republican lawmakers have experienced tremendous contributions and support from a group with growing political influence, especially among ill-informed and conservative voters, Moms for Liberty. Moms for Liberty's popularity is growing among some of the most far-right politicians and corporations, whose push range from banning books written by African-American authors on topics of racism and equality to LGBTQ themes, and those centered on sexuality and of reproductive rights. This broader effort is showing up at school board meetings across the state as Moms for Liberty-backed candidates come into power and are already making big changes that have parents and community members alarmed.
But I challenge you to break away from the core, be your own person, and vote for what is right. CRT, if CRT does not exist, why in the world will we have a resolution to ban it? That's just a slippery slope that we can stop teaching critical history like redlining, like racial gerrymandering and things like that. That's history. That's not CRT. Thank you.
Just this week, Berkeley County's school board, with which currently has 4 new members, many of them also backed by Moms for Liberty, fired their newly instated superintendent, a motion first initiated by the board's chairman, Mac McQuillan, a Moms for Liberty-backed candidate also, and approved with a 6-3 supermajority.
Watch what's the next motion. Watch the motion. Listen carefully. You all have been sandbagged.
I make a motion to terminate the employment of Mr. Dion Jackson, the superintendent of the Berkeley County School District, effective immediately. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion?
It is discussion.
I'd like to know who made the second.
Mr. Henson.
Who made the second?
I made the motion. Mr. Henson made the second.
Oh, okay.
All right. We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion?
Yes, there's discussion, absolutely.
Okay, Mr. Barrow, you're
absolutely.
recognized.
I'd like to know the justification and the rationale, reasoning for firing an individual who just was proficient in his first annual evaluation. What's the reason, Mr. Chairman? You made the motion. What's the reason why are we terminating his employment?
Mr. Barrow, I'm not going to discuss personnel matters in open session.
The school board also voted to ban critical race theory from being taught in any form across the district, a topic that leaves teachers in a tight spot.
The agenda item is a resolution to disallow the teaching of critical race theory in any form in the Berkeley County School District. I make a motion that teaching of critical race theory in any form in the Berkeley County School District be permanently disallowed.
Today, voters need to understand that this is not an attempt on our freedoms that impacts just one group. Republicans are attempting to modify all of our First Amendment rights by following alongside organizations like Moms for Liberty, whose website is quoting John Adams and saying, children should be educated and instructed in the principles of freedom. Yet, the group has worked very hard to ensure that topics that are centered on equality, Black history, and diversity are banned without due process. This has broader implications, even in the public sphere, and voters should be concerned. Republicans gaining control signals a dangerous push towards Americans' First Amendment rights being infringed upon. I had the distinguished pleasure of sitting down with Josh Malkin, legal advocate for the American Civil Liberties Union of South Carolina, to discuss more of what's at stake for all of us. Take a look. ACLU. Josh, thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure.
Listen, first of all, why don't you tell us a little bit, tell the people about, what it is that you do and what is a legislative advocate?
That's a great question, Javar. So the ACLU is dedicated to protecting constitutional and civil rights in South Carolina. And as our legislative advocate, I advance our policy agenda at the State House and also do what I can to be in local communities and help fight alongside folks as they deal with local attacks on constitutional and civil rights.
Local attacks on constitutional rights. So when you mention constitutional and civil rights, how does that coincide with what we're seeing today in school board? Because right now that's something that you're working with heavily. I had the pleasure of going with Josh to Lexington 3, their school board meeting just this week, and it was very interesting to to see how school board works. What are some of the ways that the ACLU is kind of tackling some of the issues at school board? And for those of you that don't know much about what's going on in Berkeley County and Lexington County and other places across South Carolina, why don't you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, so what we've seen a lot of recently are school boards and county councils and library boards hearing demands for, or on their own initiative, attempting to ban books in school and public libraries. And that is an attack on students' First Amendment right to access information. So we're showing up wherever we can.
So what are some of the ways that you've been sort of taking steps to help counter these? Because these are widespread efforts to ban students' ability to access literature. And is there a particular type of literature that we're seeing under attack or under fire?
There is some variation between locales, but there commonly attempts to ban books about race and racism and racial inequity, and also books that feature LGBTQ plus characters. Also attacks on books that feature, any sort of depiction of sexual acts, mental health. They're pretty sweeping in some places, but in others they're a little more targeted.
Wow.
So in Lexridge 5, a parent submitted a complaint about a book called Black is a Rainbow Color, which is a book for, I'd imagine, I don't know exactly, but I imagine 5 to 7-year-old children. And it's really just a book about Black joy, about Black history. And the complaint form exposed that this was about one woman's misguided discomfort about white children seeing Black joy, seeing Black history. And as sad as it is, that woman's entitled to her opinion. But for that woman's opinion to automatically pull the book off of shelves for every Black child and every white child in that district while the book is under review is really problematic. So I think that school boards that are using that policy need to think about some of the practical consequences of it.
I think so too. I mean, the broader implications of that are devastating. Now, we got to hear in Lexington 3 the testimony from one of the librarians at BL Middle School who was just devastated that essentially books were being pulled off of shelves without what she called as the due process. What's typically a due process that these school boards have to follow? Is there a policy in the state law that requires them to do this, or do they ultimately create their own processes? And is there a process?
Yeah, so it's a great question. School boards have a lot of say over their own governance. So a lot of them do follow this state model policy. They've chosen to adopt a model policy. And what the model policy seems to call for is a parent submits a complaint form where they have to have read the book in its entirety. They have to state what their objection to the material is. And then seemingly, once that complaint is submitted, a review committee is formed. The review committee is made up of teachers, librarians, admin, I want to say, school board members maybe, teachers, and they go through a review process. And then typically, the review committee makes the recommendation, and then it varies by district, but either the school board or the superintendent will either accept the review committee's recommendation or overturn it. So that's the policy, and when the policy is followed with fidelity, there are still some practical consequences that are problematic, as we've seen. But what we're also seeing is that that policy isn't always followed with fidelity. In Beaufort, somebody submitted 97 titles, 99 titles. Wow. We've heard differing accounts of whether paperwork was ever submitted there, but they certainly didn't form review committees right away. And we showed up and let the school board know that we really had problems with that. And again, information after the fact has been a little muddy too. So we've got some different accounts.
When you say muddy, do you mean just not transparency about the process in general?
I think different folks have gotten different accounts from different school board officials. So I'm less in the know than some other folks in that community. But I've gotten a few reports that seem to be contradictory on what's happening post.
So seemingly that's an opportunity for them to obstruct, in essence, their true intentions. Or maybe do you feel like they don't want people to know about the titles that are under review?
Yeah, I mean, I always go in assuming that decision makers involved in educations, involved in libraries, have the best intentions, right? And the political pressure they face is real. I don't doubt that, and I hate that folks are receiving threatening calls, demanding that books be removed from shelves. But that can't trump government transparency. It can't trump the Constitution. Right. It shouldn't trump every parent being able to choose what their own child reads. It shouldn't trump students being able to have a voice in what books they have access to.
I love how you, at the Lexington 3 meeting, were saying to that board, who just almost seemed as if they were aghast, taken so far back that they just became completely, elusive to what was going on. Either that or they have the most amazing poker face that you could ever see. But to say that it is our fundamental right, and to take these books off of bookshelves, you are disenfranchising people from learning. And it's learning is a fundamental right, but it is American. Yeah. It is American.
Yes.
Yeah. I love that because it really spoke such volumes. And even some of our viewers that had the opportunity to see the Lexington 3 coverage that we did, agreed that even though we have differences and some things do make all of us uncomfortable in one way or another, we shouldn't stifle other people's ability to explore those topics.
Right. And that's why this is really not a partisan issue for the most part. People calling for bans may belong to one party or another. They may belong to both parties, right? But in either party, on either side of the aisle, whatever ideology, they are a minority. Even folks who may disagree with information in a certain book understand that removing that information from library shelves, whether they agree with it or not, is dangerous, is unconstitutional.
Yeah, it is unconstitutional. And it really does take us further back in history than I think many people do realize in addressing this topic. But again, that transparency element, the obstruction, is what I think is the larger problem. Is the fact that most voters, because this was a highly contested midterm. We know that was, this was a huge opportunity, some feel like, especially on the left, to really protect these types of rights. But I think so often we don't know really how to get involved in the conversation. And I think too, and you tell me if this has been your experience, a lot of people feel like maybe that's out of their lane or it's not accessible. So what are some of the things that perhaps more people could do to be more informed?
Yeah, great. I think that folks who want to be informed, engaged, monitor your local meeting agendas, because this stuff can just kind of slide by, as vigilant as we're trying to be.
And not even posted in clear language on the minutes or agendas.
Right. So, for example, in Lexington 3, and again, this hasn't been confirmed 100% to me, stamped was banned, right? There was a review committee formed. We don't know under what policy, but stamped has been banned, fairly certain, at both the middle school and the high school.
And Lexington 3, when we were looking at the agenda for that school board meeting, I didn't see this anywhere.
Right. So what was on the agenda was the second reading of their library material reconsideration or review policy, right? It wasn't handed out to the public. I haven't yet been able to find it on the website. Nothing was discussed. The fact that the book was being reviewed or banned, and that other books are currently under review wasn't discussed. And that's not typical in my experience.
Because that's not really the policy, right?
Well, I mean, since the new policy isn't being discussed, I don't know what policy they're currently operating under. It's been reported to me that a school official initiated the complaint independently of anyone can parent.
The principal. I was under the impression, based on the information provided by the librarian, that it was actually the school's principal that removed the book.
Right.
And she wasn't aware that if there was anybody that represented a librarian, because based on the policy, you have to have the librarian, as you mentioned, but she wasn't in the know.
No, I think there are definitely some questions, some uncertainties about how things are operating in Lex 3. But to get back to your earlier question, I think as freedom to read and pro-truth both exist to be safe havens for teachers and librarians who are experiencing censorship. I don't want any teacher or any librarian to have to choose between doing what they think is right and potentially losing their job.
And librarians are educators.
Absolutely.
As we learn from
often doubly mastered. Often have masters in teaching and masters in library sciences. Absolutely. They're competent, expert professionals. They have established protocol for vetting, for selecting and reviewing and placing materials. Yes, absolutely. So once we know about it, once statewide and statewide orgs know about it, try to connect with folks we know in the local community. What you can do if you're comfortable is go to the meeting and speak. You can be someone who's there to support, and maybe after going to a meeting or two, you feel like you're ready to speak.
Because then you'll have a perspective.
Right.
Yeah. So if you feel like, this isn't my fight, this isn't something that, I can get into, but it's something that concerns me, you can still get involved.
Absolutely. Schedule a call with folks who are making decisions about the review. There's a lot you can do, but it's problematic that there are barriers to the information.
To be misconstrued about this. This affects everyone.
Yes.
And if we don't actually, begin to really control this narrative and put it, what I would say, right, this could go out of school board and go into the masses.
Oh, it's happening. It's happening in public libraries as well.
So there is this, what some would say, a racial reckoning. I recently watched a video on Joy Reid of Kimberly Crenshaw, who was discussing whether or not CRT, which this is kind of what spawned this whole book banning process, right, was CRT.
I would say they're related.
They are related because CRT, they're saying, is being taught in schools, which is the reason why the books were being attacked in the first place, because they found a correlation. These groups, and particularly the Moms for Liberty group, was saying that they had found correlation between CRT being taught in our schools and the rhetoric that are in some of these different books. But Ms. Crenshaw, recently stated, as one of the individuals who not only coined the term, but who presented many articles on the few books about CRT that she says are not even taught as often as she would like in college.
Right.
And so to hear groups like Moms for Liberty say, and Republicans, and recently I know you've probably seen the South Carolina Freedom Caucus, who is now suing, is it Lexington? It's Lexington 1. Lexington 1 school district. That's not even a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what both sides can likely agree on, if we're having an honest conversation, is this isn't about critical race theory. I think everyone acknowledges that what the nationally manufactured hysteria is is about is not a critical race theory, and critical race theory is now being used as an umbrella term to encompass anything that is making certain parents uncomfortable, or so they say, right? So you hear, these are nationally manufactured talking points. Social emotional learning is not critical race theory. Culturally relevant pedagogy is not critical race theory. We're not talking about critical race theory.
Right.
We're talking about the rights of parents to have complete control over their child's education. And parents absolutely deserve to have a say in their child's education. As a former educator, I prioritize communicating with my students' parents, and that's something that has always existed between parents and teachers. When you listen to folks talk about it, they're not complaining about their children's teachers. They're not complaining about their local librarians. It's abstract because they've latched on, folks are latching on to this and saying what they want.
And just inserting what they want
Yes.
on the premise of, I'm white, and discussing Black history or difficult topics in American history now makes me uncomfortable.
That messaging is definitely there. Yep.
That's because that's what I get from this. I think the offense for me comes with trying to take away the voices. For me, as an American, we're doing that right now, right? Where we're using our voices to talk about this and inform people who should know that their voices are essentially being taken from them because one group or another finds difficulty being able to manage the feelings or the emotions associated with difficult topics.
Sure.
I think so often we get information so late.
Yep.
By the time it is for us to begin moving and for us to start mobilizing, these decisions have already been made.
Sure.
And so you tell me, since you spend so much time at the State House, but it makes the fight like 10 times harder at that point, right?
Yeah, and it does become tricky because if you are someone who opposes book bans, you're likely not going to know preemptively, right? The banner is going to go in and demand the ban, and then often the best case scenario is we hear about it immediately after, and we can try to get the other perspective in there before a decision is made. But yeah, I think for folks who, maybe there aren't bans in your community or you don't know about them, I think folks should be, doing what they can to pay attention to what's happening locally. I will say that there are lawyers and firms across the state and across the nation who really value the First Amendment, as many South Carolinians do. And if that, it comes to use that tool in our toolbox to protect constitutional rights, folks are subjecting themselves and their communities to lawsuits.
Truly, whatever side you're on, this really is a nonpartisan issue. Despite what some of these groups like Moms for Liberty and Palmetto Family and all those would try to make it, because it seems that this gives them the opportunity to appeal to their base. And they've made CRT sort of like the boogeyman, which allows them to really be able to, implement or execute their own personal agendas. But when we look at this fight in essence, it really is an infringement on our First Amendment right. No matter if you're Republican, Independent, Libertarian, Green Party, no matter what you are, it will affect you as an American and a citizen of the state of South Carolina.
Yeah, and the Freedom to Read Coalition and Pro-Truth Coalition both don't have any partisan organizations. And a lot of the coalition partners are groups that are just dedicated to good, transparent governance, that are just dedicated to academic freedom. And folks probably have opinions on both sides of certain content, right? We probably have coalition partners or members who belong to certain coalition partners who would disagree with certain content or not, but they still see that the control of access to information is a bad thing and can take us down a really terrifying path.
The one thing that I love that Jill Schlapnick mentioned at that board meeting was that books make us better people. And as an inner city kid growing up in probably one of the most dangerous places in America, San Bernardino, California, before I came here to South Carolina, I remember as a little inner city kid You know, 75 cents was all I wanted every day.
Yeah.
Because for 75 cents, I would be able to go from my neighborhood to the Norman Feldman Library. And it appeared, you know, when everything else was, you know, because the 90s was pretty rough in California. It was pretty rough. But to go there and to learn about topics that people weren't discussing with me at home.
Yeah.
I learned about sex education and how important it was to abstain. And I learned, you know, certain values that have made me a better person to create opportunities for others. I couldn't imagine growing up in this time as a young person.
Yeah.
Books open you up to love. They make us see each other in a different way.
Yep.
That inspires us, because we don't hate each other.
Right.
We don't hate each other. We hate corporate greed. we know that the greedy and the few at the top make it so difficult for everybody else at the bottom. But in essence, when we look at what literature does and what people telling their own truth does for the human condition, you know, I'm grateful for people like you that are fighting every day for our ability to just pick up information, whatever our curiosities will lead us to. You know, this is becoming a really strong passion of mine, because I would not have known. I wouldn't have known, like many of you out there, I would not have known that all of this was taking place, because the larger media really only gives you maybe one side, or, you know, little bits and pieces. But until I became a part of Pro-Truth Coalition, and I love Pro-Truth Coalition because it's such a diverse group of people. It truly
is, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the Pro-Truth Coalition?
Yeah.
Because you invited me.
Yeah, well, best thing I've ever done. Pro-Truth was formed last fall, prior to the legislative session, founded by the E3 Foundation, Low Country Black Parents Association out of Charleston, the ACLU South Carolina, and the Legal Defense Fund, and they brought on a lot more partners. But it was brought on in response to what were originally 5 bills to censor classroom curriculum. And yeah, I mean, because these bills were so expansive in who they attacked, there's really diverse support. The coalition is a truly diverse body, and there were 19 hours of public testimony, and our, you know, folks who opposed classroom censorship were 16 of them.
I never spent that much time at the State House.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, and you know, it was just clear that there are definitely groups of people in South Carolina who claim to want this, but they're, again, a minority, and what the 19 hours of public testimony demonstrated was just that, right? When we're 16 of the 19 hours, and the folks who want this are all saying the same thing, and, you know, not really accurately capturing what social emotional learning is, culturally responsive teaching, positive behavioral incentive systems, I think it just became apparent to both representatives and senators that this wasn't the right thing to do for a number of really eloquent, passionate reasons that were expressed.
And interestingly enough as well, is that some of the issues that people like Adam Morgan, you know, who was up there on the education subcommittee, were arguing didn't exist. We heard a lot of testimony from, you know, both sides, that even from educators, seasoned educators, former superintendents, and all these different, you know, formidable educators. The school system was working. Those books had been checked because librarians have such integrity. Librarians really do review, cross-check, back-check, you know, dot every I and cross every T, no pun intended, to make sure that the literature that's going in the schools is appropriate for every grade level and every library.
Our librarians are professionals. These are folks who dedicated their lives because they want to be a part of the academic exploration and personal growth that happens in life. That is the spirit of a library, right? That's why these folks are librarians.
And librarians are educators.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And the other point I want to make on both of these fights is students' voices are being systematically left out, right? So when we talk about, there's a lot of talk these days about parental rights, and parents should always have a say in what their what their child is learning, what their child is reading. They have that right, but so should our students, right? Especially when you talk about middle school and high school students. I was talking to a veteran English teacher today, and a best practice is to have high school students on review committees, because if the overwhelming majority of the adult population doesn't know a book is being banned, it's likely students don't either, right? And the students should have a say in how they're being impacted and how they would like to learn, what they'd like to have access to. So I'm not saying they should be the sole voice, but for them to not have any voice in what's happening to their education, I think is problematic, and is, we're not placing much faith in our next generation of leaders.
That's actually, I think, very cultural here, because historically, in especially in the Black diaspora, but I think it's a very Southern thing too, where children are to be seen and not heard. There is a lot of emphasis on children being seen and not heard. And children's voices don't ring very loud to adults, because here in the South, you're being grown. You're being mannish, or as they would say, fast, Right. Truly, because these aren't the same young people. I was one of those kids that was really curious. I grew up in a very Southern traditional home. There were a lot of things that weren't talked about, but I was still curious. Right. I wanted to learn. I wanted to know more about the world outside. And it seemed that I was being packed into a box. And there was always a fight to, learn as much as I can. Children are sponges. Yeah. But I think adults are just not as prepared to accept that this group of young people, they know so much more than prior generations. Right. And I think that these elders, these parents today are going to have to accept it. They're going to have to accept the fact that technology has increased the knowledge of this generation tenfold.
Yeah, and I'd say they shouldn't, it's not that they're going to have to, I think they should. I think it's in society's best interest. There's a lot of genius and innovation amongst the younger generation, and to stifle that until we've determined they're old enough to express themselves, I think it's detrimental to society. I think we should be actively looking to have our younger people engage and share their perspective on it.
Because other countries are training their children, at exponential rates, at much faster rates. Their younger people spend so much time in places where places in the United States, don't test very well, or are much further behind in mathematics and science, engineering and robotics and all these types of places, because we do not allow our young people to expand, explore. Yep. And so when you talk about how detrimental and devastating this is to a society, those that don't grasp this concept need to understand there are physical and emotional ramifications to the gerrymandering and an obstruction of learning in America. I tell you, I'm so much more informed every time I sit and talk to you, and I'm really glad that we had the opportunity to sit down and talk with you today, because there is just so much out there that we're just so unaware of that impacts our everyday living.
Can I make 2 plugs for folks?
Absolutely, please let us know.
So to join the fight against classroom censorship, please go to protruthsc.org. There's a contact form in the top right corner that will get you on the email list. And to get involved with the attack on our libraries, please visit Freedom to Read SC on Facebook with a webpage coming soon.
Absolutely. Well, you heard it first. Josh, we really appreciate you. Thank you so very much for coming on today. Be sure to like and subscribe and share this content. Thanks for tuning in. Today's episode of Sunday Soul on the Columbia Urban Broadcast Network is brought to you by
In Columbia, Sunday Soul.